Okay, so welcome everyone. Back to the classroom is the motto of this and last week, and I'm really happy to see you all here. And some of you are joining us via Zoom. Hört man nicht?
Wir mussten ja ranhalten.
Oh, okay. Ich weiß nicht, ob das unter Hygienevorschriften so. Okay, again, can you all hear me well until the back of the room? Okay, perfect. Welcome back to the classroom. This is the first session of this lecture series that we're actually having in the classroom with some of you here, some of you via Zoom in a hybrid format. And today we have a guest speaker with us, Stefan Reichelstein, who I would like to announce in a couple of sentences. And I made some notes on a very little piece of paper, but all the accomplishments of Stefan would never fit on even a large piece of paper. So I'm trying to make it short. So Stefan is actually an economist. He studied economics, and then he studied managerial economics at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University, where he received his PhD in 1984. And over the last 30 years, Stefan has published many papers in top journals, from management science to nature energy, and he has really held professorships at the top schools in the US, including UC Berkeley and Stanford. Stefan is with us here in Mannheim since 2017-18. Officially, I think you started in 2018. And since then, Stefan has built up the Mannheim Institute for Sustainable Energy Studies, the MISES. And this is a center that really gives a home to all the topics around decarbonization in Mannheim. And if you look at how this center has developed, it's really amazing. There is an ongoing regular lecture series with top speakers from all around the world giving input on the topic. Stefan is collaborating with a lot of big companies all around Germany and I think even beyond. And he really is at the forefront of climate action. And I'm happy today to have you here with us in the classroom to give a talk. I think the title is Rapid and Deep Decarbonization. And that's exactly what we need at the moment. So thank you for taking the time, for being here with us. And I would say the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'll try to put this on. See whether this works. Can you hear me well acoustically? Is the not so? I'm getting mixed messages in the back. I guess I could wear this as around my neck as an alternative. All right. Is this any better? Good. You might as well consider coming a little closer. That would make life a little easier for us, but I guess now you're comfortable where you are. Okay, so pleasure to be here. Thank you, Laura, for the very gracious introduction. And I guess we have a total of 90 minutes for this lecture. Incidentally, I'm offering a course here right now for the first time in the undergraduate and the bachelor program here at the University of Mannheim. In fact, I think I see a couple of faces who are in both the course and with us today. Those who are in the course are going to see in a moment a couple of slides that you have already seen, and you're also going to get a couple of slides that you will see in future weeks of this course. Title, I think, is self-explanatory. Laura already hinted at it. Decarbonization as one of the defining issues of our time. And just about everybody, other than perhaps a few holdouts in the world, agree it needs to happen soon, and it needs to happen on a massive scale. Otherwise, the world is going to be in some serious trouble. So since this is the Science for Future lecture series, I wasn't quite sort of sure how to angle this. And I thought I'll start with what in the US is sort of a familiar quote coined by an ex-baseball player. The future is not what it used to be. And this is, I think, very appropriate in the context of climate and climate change, simply because the overall situation and the overall analysis is things are getting ever more urgent, and there are some really dark clouds on the horizon unless the world sort of changes its tune. So on that, I really want to use this time here to give you a perspective. What is the nature and the urgency of the problem? We all read about it, but I think in all the detailed discussions in the media, we sometimes sort of forget the bigger picture. And then I want to really start to ask the question, is this all still doable in the remaining time that climate scientists tell us we have? And people disagree on this, so I want to give you sort of my take on where I think things are going and whether we still have a decent chance to avoid a real climate catastrophe that some people do warn us about. Yeah. By the way, in terms of format here, I think, Laura, you told me it's generally sort of an hour and 30 minutes. We can do it that way, perfectly fine. I'll be glad to sort of stop after 60 minutes. But a better format would be if you interrupt me anytime and we sort of enter a discussion. And the slides will become publicized anyhow. So if I don't get through some of the slides, that's totally okay. Yeah. So in short, feel free to interrupt if I use any sort of terms, language, or concepts that either you don't get or you disagree. Please interrupt. Okay, here is the beginning of the problem. This is a chart. I don't know whether in the back it is easy to see. That shows nothing more than carbon dioxide emissions resulting from the use of fossil fuels. And as you can see here, this begins in 1950 and goes for basically a 70-year period. The largest, if you, I don't know whether you can see the color coding, the largest blocks in this are coal at the very top in gray, oil red, and then gas underneath it. And then there's also a small sliver for cement and other sources. So these are just CO2 emissions, and you see they have gone from about 10 gigatons, 10 billion tons of CO2 equivalent in 1960 to now about 36 roughly. And there's a little blip there, but there was some hope that in 2020 perhaps the world has finally come to the point where the overall level of emissions are declining, but that turned out to be largely a COVID response. And then you see things are picking up again in 2021 on the backdrop of the world economy roughly growing 6%, so the use of fossil fuels grew correspondingly, and we're pretty much back to pre-pandemic levels. You could say, well, at least it's not rising any further, but if there is any notion of the world really reducing emissions, we don't have any indication of that yet, by this chart. So what does this mean for climate change? Here's a chart that shows pretty much over the same time period, 1960 through 2016, the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is here in this first part. I'm going to give you 5 slides sort of on what you may call the climate science part of the whole equation before we get to the economic side of the equation. And you see concentrations, this is measured in parts per million, have gone from a level of roughly 320 in 1960. By the way, the climate scientists tell us, based on their sources, if we go back to pre-industrial levels, that is back into the 18th or the 19th century, the long time sort of base value was 280 parts per million. So this has gone in just in these 50 or 56 years from 320 now to 400, and on this picture in 2016 it ends sort of at 405 parts per million. This is ultimately the thing we need to keep in mind, because when we talk about global warming, the thing that really matters is, so at least the scientists tell us on this one, it is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And that, of course, is a very complicated feedback process. in terms of the atmosphere being able to absorb some of that CO2, the oceans and the land, but us being mankind constantly also emitting at this very fast rate. If you look at that chart, you may say, well, okay, given how the emissions have risen, that's what we would expect. Is this really so dramatic? Is this such a reason to worry? The chart that keeps me up at night is this one here, and that is CO2 concentrations not over the last 50 years, but over the last 800,000 years. So this is really on a large scale. We're going back from today, 800,000 years ago. Obviously, we need all sorts of proxy measures on this one in terms of what the concentrations have been. But people can do this from tree rings, they can do it from ice cores and other things to get at least an approximation of what these concentrations in the atmosphere were. And the thing to notice is there were sharp ups and downs for reasons that some people sort of say have to do with probably have to do with natural phenomena in the way of solar forcing, changes in radiation. All of these things contributed. The thing that you should keep in mind here, and that's why I sort of drew the red arrow up in the corner there, this is the rise in concentrations really over the last 100 years out of those 800,000 years. So this is sometimes when people look at this chart, they think this is actually the vertical boundary of this chart. It's not. This is how quickly the concentrations have risen in those last 100 years, 120 years, say, since the beginning of, since the Industrial Revolution really got going. So that shows really how dramatic the development of the last 100 years is, perfectly coincident with the time that mankind started to rely on fossil fuels for industrial processes and to power our modern economies. Yeah? So that really is the nature of the problem. So we all have heard about this, of course, now for decades. And the question that I think many of us sort of posing is, why is this such a hard problem? Every organization, presidents, popes, leaders of all sorts of organizations are telling us this is really threatening. It's an existential problem. Here, this picture I think was taken in Heidelberg not long ago. People taking to the streets on Fridays in more and more countries. All of that is happening. We all know it, and yet progress so far seems to have been minuscule, if there was any. Yeah? That's the sober reality in all of this. So here are some reasons that people give, and I think for the people who, depending on what your field is, you may want to sort of keep these in mind, because that sort of doesn't naturally fit into the paradigm that you're in. First of all, there are the so-called climate skeptics, the ones who say, well, you just showed us this chart here. These things have their ups and downs, and they always did. Big deal. Coincidence, And then you go, wow, but it really is off the charts now. Is it still a coincidence? Yeah, we don't know. We don't know. Those climate skeptics, I think, are slowly dying out, but slowly. I personally also think they are not really climate skeptics. I think they're playing a game. They're really the representatives of certain established industries that just don't want to change it because they stand to lose a lot of money in this. So I don't worry too much about the climate skeptics as being really a hindrance, an impediment to making progress on this. A bigger argument is the world has gotten very used to oil, gas, and coal over 100 years. The modern economies, the industrialized economies, even developing economies, depend on it. It's the lifeblood. And it's hard to change that. Some people will also argue that there are no real alternatives. No real alternatives in that these fossil fuels are so abundant. At some point, people, long before your time, people worried about the limitations of having enough oil in the world. Nobody's worried about that anymore. It has changed, but people are now in the situation, we have enough oil for the foreseeable future. We also have enough of the other fossil fuels, and they're cheap and they're very convenient to generate the electricity to power our modern economies. So that's hard to get rid of. I think there's some truth to that, but then you have to now get into the hard discussion. Well, okay, how difficult is it going to be? How costly is it going to be to make the switch away from these things? And on the other hand, face this issue about a rapidly changing climate in which the world will not look anywhere the way it does look today if we let this go unchecked into the future. Economists have correctly pointed out that this is also an intrinsic issue with the modern market economies that we live in which people look at prices and make production and consumption decisions. And what we have here is basically what economists refer to as the tragedy of the commons. So the tragedy of the commons is that you have a common good, a public good, in this case the atmosphere, and it's being degraded. Why? It's being degraded because when people make their own individual decisions in this market economy, they are really not taking the social cost of their actions into consideration. When you all came here today by some form of transportation, you may have driven a car, you may have taken another form of transportation. You didn't give much thought to, well, am I now putting a burden on all the billions of other people in terms of degrading the atmosphere any further? A market economy works exactly like this, that you don't need to do this, but that you can just look at your own budget, you can make your own decisions, and that's the end of the story. When it comes to public goods, or public bads in this case, the market economy and all the things that we usually argue are the advantages of a market economy in terms of allocative efficiency no longer apply. And that's why you see here this quote from Nicholas Stern. He's a person at the London School of Economics who was asked a couple of years ago, by now quite a few years ago, by Tony Blair, then the Prime Minister of Britain, to study this problem, and he coined the term that I fully agree with: this is the greatest market failure in the history of mankind. And how to address it is really still up for grabs. It is, of course, being tried at international levels. We see all the meetings by the United Nations, the climate conferences, the last COP26 in Scotland last November. Hopes are high, but most people go, we're not sure that this is really yet on track to change. This will be a fundamental directional change to address this problem. But is it really happening? So I'm going here deliberately. I'm becoming, more and more pessimistic. But I do want to tell you that I think there are a number of reasons to believe that this isn't lost yet. And a couple of things that people are not, in my mind, not yet paying enough discussion to in the public discussion of how this could still turn around in time. I'm doing this as a monologue here. It's fine with me. I can keep talking, but if you want to I'm now moving on to the next stage in this talk. Any comments, questions, perspectives? No? Okay, all right. Then I'll move on. So, I don't have a timer here. Laura, you will keep me honest on the time? Yeah? Okay, then I'll definitely stop after 1 hour. So let's see. There are a couple of countries that have taken at least the initiative at the individual country level. Europe, the European Union, being arguably the most proactive on this. The US also has made considerable progress, and I want to sort of show you that progress and then ask, how has this been made possible? And is that progress that we have seen in select parts of the world, that of course can't solve the global problem by itself, but is there reason to believe that other countries may follow suit, and that this will have sort of a spillover effect in terms of others also changing basically their economic structures and their emission levels. So on this one here, you see the total emissions within the European Union, this time split by different sectors of the economy. And you see the top one, the most significant one, is energy supply. So I think this refers to largely electricity supply. So this is the generation of power. And you see this has come down actually quite a bit over the last 30 years in this. The others, transportation, next one, industry, more or less constant. And then it goes into agriculture, shipping, international shipping, and also aviation, that is basically the emissions from airplanes. Since you're not asking me any questions, I'll ask you a question. Why do you think the electricity sector has shown some declines from, this is 1.5 gigatons to roughly 1 gigaton. So it has been cut roughly by 1/3 in terms of tons of emissions. Yeah, either one of you, or both of you. Okay, so renewables coming on during that time period here in Europe.
Maybe devices has gotten more effective, that they don't use that much energy.
Okay, so energy efficiency measures, which have led to actually less electricity consumption. Actually, that turns out to be not true. I mean, there is definitely a lot in terms of energy efficiency, but I think if you're looking at the consumption of electricity, that has not gone down. And I'm going to make the point that actually it also shouldn't go down, in the sense that what we need to do is, going forward, we need to actually electrify a whole bunch of sectors of our economies that then hopefully are being run on clean energy, that is on low carbon electricity. But so no, that's not a large factor. Anything else comes to mind? So electricity consumption reduction is not a large factor. That has actually gone up, if anything.
Maybe also the awareness of energy supply, so turning the lights off, or just more awareness of climate change, carbon dioxide in general.
That would sort of dovetail what your neighbor just said in terms of efficiencies, awareness, but it has not helped the overall consumption, the use of electricity, at least in Germany. This is at the European level. Yeah. The coal plants, yeah. So that's really the big change here. And I'm going to show you in a moment here, or I can go there right away for the US. The same picture is happening. Power, electricity, here is in green. And you see that one also has, in the US, declined substantially. And I attribute this, renewables are playing a role. They're increasingly playing a role. But in the overall, if you ask yourself what percentage of the electricity consumed in the whole economy comes from renewables, it is still, at the European and at the US level, relatively high. There are, of course, countries like Germany, or in the US, say the state of California, where this is a lot higher. But if you're aggregating across whole countries or blocks of countries, it is largely, primarily, the decline in the use of coal. And with that has come a switch to either natural gas or nuclear power, having taken over also some of that.
I had another question, because you were talking about other countries maybe having the spillover effect
Mm-hmm.
of like using it
Mm-hmm.
renewable energy sources. How do you feel about countries that heavily rely on, or the economy like maybe China that heavily relies on these fossil fuels, or maybe even like some extreme examples like Qatar that built like this rich and wealthy society on these fossil fuels?
I think there is a real possibility, and the reason that I think there is a real possibility is, and this will be sort of coming up in a minute, there is this whole transformation going on in which the competing low carbon sources are becoming successively cheaper. And so if you sort of think again about the fundamental trade-off here about traditionally the fossil fuels being convenient and the cheap alternative, that is changing, and it's changing precisely because a few leaders in the world, and I would include Germany among those, have sort of developed and improved that technology so that the transition for other countries, and now I'm thinking even beyond China, really developing countries where energy is relatively a particularly expensive good, for them it's going to be much easier to make this transition because the sacrifice they would have to make in terms of buying not the cheapest alternative is going down very quickly. Yeah? So this is sort of this whole dynamic over the next few years. Anything I should do differently? No? Laura, yeah. Yeah?
We saw that Germany was still kind of pushing for gas, right? And France was on the other side pushing for nuclear power to be, for example, labeled as sustainable energies in the EU taxonomy. And here we see kind of political interest differences with regard to the background of how the countries are organized and structured, right? How do you see that on the path to zero for the EU? How can these countries kind of harmonize their political interests?
Obviously a huge question, and I'll give you a 1-minute answer. Obviously this is a big one in terms of coordination here at the European level in the current political situation. I'm overall a little afraid if we go into sort of the current situation, we're never going to come back to these slides. We can't do that. Let's do, yeah. I mean, it's obviously, this is also highly speculative. We're of course all thinking about this question: how dependable are different European countries, Germany versus others? You know, Hungary is in the news a lot these days as being even more dependent and therefore sort of not willing to go along with an embargo. Let me only perhaps sort of for now say one thing. While as terrible as the war in the Ukraine at the moment is, and as much as I also expect there to be substantial economic sacrifices, not just on the parts of the Ukraine, but all of Europe for this, this is going to have a major effect in terms of accelerating the transition to clean energy. I think this is, in the longer term, if you're now thinking 5 years ahead, it's going to make things a lot faster than they would have been otherwise. So if there is any silver lining in this tragedy, I see it here. Okay, let me do one other thing and I'll do this relatively quickly with an eye on the time. We have seen, of course, regulations, and I want to talk about the regulations in countries like Germany, the European Union, in particular with its so-called cap and trade system in a moment, how effective that has been, and other policy measures that have been taken, say, in select states within the US, countries like Australia as well, that give me sort of some hope that this is slowly turning around. The question is how fast enough. One thing that you may have picked up, depending on how interested you are in this subject, is something that I find as a Betriebswirt, I find absolutely fascinating. And this is this recent net zero movement. This is basically started, I would say, 2.5 years ago, as I see it, where global corporations sort of came out, and it, interestingly enough, started in the oil and gas sector, saying, yeah, we understand this is a serious problem. And we also see the protest movements on Fridays around the world, we now understand our social responsibility. And so you should trust us when we say, we here XYZ, we will be carbon neutral by 2050. I did a recent count in a paper. I think among the so-called Fortune 500 companies globally, more than half are now out with a pledge like this. Of course, the question that immediately comes up is, what does this really mean? Should this give us real hope that this is turning? Can we even think of this, as you see here on my bullet points, as almost sort of an alternative to governmental action and to regulation? Is this sort of now, are people doing this on a voluntary basis because they told us they would do so? If you look at it a little, and critics, this is my fourth bullet point there, critics are of course going, big deal. There is that 50 to 60-year-old CEO who says, by the way, in 30 years, we're going to be carbon neutral. Check in with me again then, okay? But in the meantime, don't bother me. Leave me alone. Yeah? Greenwashing, window dressing, those are the terms that you hear also a lot in this discussion, and you can see why people might be skeptical that a pledge out 30 years issued by somebody with no further context is something where people go, I don't know what this really means. I learned recently that the UN secretary actually got a former Canadian trade minister to start a commission that has basically, it's called a watchdog group that is going exactly after this net zero movement. So this committee, it will only have moral authority if you want to, has no other objective than to basically follow companies on these pledges and to try to get a sense of, do they really mean it? Is there any indication that they will translate this into real action or not? One big question, and this is something that as somebody who comes out of the accounting field traditionally, I have a particular interest in, is this whole question of how, when companies say they are going to be net zero or they're going down to net zero, how do they actually measure their own corporate carbon footprint? I showed you earlier pictures where we're basically aggregating total emissions across different sectors or whole economies. That is relatively uncontroversial, even though it involves a lot of estimation, because these are totals. If you now break this down to an individual company to ask the question, what is the carbon footprint of IKEA or any other run-of-the-mill company, that's a much harder question. And that, of course, needs to be answered and agreed upon if you want to have any chance to check where things are going to be so many years into the future, if you want sort of interim checks. Mm-hmm. So I thought I'll start right at home, the state of Baden-Württemberg. And Laura, as the Prorektorin, is very familiar with that issue, now has to come up basically with a way to implement an initiative by the state government saying, we want Klimaneutralität, so carbon neutrality, by 2030 for the administration of the state, and they're viewing the universities as part of the administration, unfortunately, but they always do, okay? So the universities are part of this now too, and the universities, I guess, if I understand Laura correctly, will have to sort of say how they're going to make this work. Notice here the horizon is a lot shorter. It's only 9 years, depending on if you go to the end of 2030. But what exactly this means is, I think, up for grabs. Laura will correct me if in the meantime she has already sort of made up her mind how this whole question of how do we measure our footprint here for a university, what do we include? In particular, do we include you guys? In what form? Am I included? Probably. I think I'm part of the Verwaltung. But lots of questions of what the boundaries are when you talk about what are the carbon emissions, the footprint associated with it. I think my impression also is, and I'll sort of stop this point, people saw this is going to be very ambitious to do this in 8 years. After all, most of the discussions talks about 20, 30 years time still left to get to a zero position. One interesting thing that's going to come up, and that has come up a lot with other firms in this net zero movement, is this whole notion that rather than actually reducing your emissions, you could do something in the way of getting basically an offset. In other words, you're making sure that somewhere else no emissions are happening. In the extreme, you could actually pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's one of the things that are sort of happening already commercially, but they're very expensive at the moment. Either nature-based or mechanical through a production process. Would we sort of want to allow that if it's really to be a net zero position, that is my gross emissions minus what I'm pulling out adds up to something less than or equal than zero? Yeah? Yes?
So just about the emissions part, like, of course it might sound like very ambitious to get to neutral.
Can you take the microphone, or I'll come a little closer?
Right now?
Not yet?
Okay. Yeah, it's on. Yeah, just about the ambitious part. So, wouldn't it, however, be better to formulate our goals like this? Like, okay, we want to be neutral by 2030 in order to get like as close to zero as possible. Because if we state that we want it for like 20 or 30 years, it'll probably even take much longer, and we don't know if we will reach the goal in the end. And then I think that often also these net zero pledges, they include some kind of like compensation, because even if we have that goal of getting like neutral by 2030, we're all aware of the fact that we won't like have zero emissions by that point, but we can compensate in different ways, like within our own community, or also by building, planting more trees, whatever, or even like more advanced strategies like pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. So isn't that like always part of the net zero strategies?
So I think you're raising a whole bunch of questions that this is really not that well defined as a concept. If I just give you the line, I want to be carbon neutral in some form. I think what you refer to as compensation and offsets, these two words are used interchangeably. But the whole point of the next two slides is, I'll give you a couple of other examples, is at the moment, this is, I call it sort of the Wild West. In other words, anything goes. Everybody defines their own metric, defines their own timetable, defines their own rules. So I'm not, I think this watchdog agency by the UN that I mentioned is desperately needed, because this is what in sort of my colleagues in Betriebswirtschaftslehre would call sort of the classic phenomenon if you don't have a regulatory framework, but you only have voluntary efforts by companies that are very motivated, of course, to say, we would like to be seen as wearing the green mantle. We pay attention. We know what our social responsibility is. And consumers, please pay attention. We are really the good guys. But as long as there is no framework for this, everybody pretty much can do their own thing, and all the important details that you're asking about are being sort of lost and swept under the rug.
And
So-
maybe one more question to that.
Yeah.
Hasn't the EU done some like regulatories on that when they were also like giving out patents, or like I'm not sure how you call them in English, but like that firms can like emit a certain type of CO2, or like the papers that it can be traded and everything.
Yeah.
At least therefore there need to be some kind of regulatories.
Yes. And I'm going to come to that, hopefully still in time. I have a lot more faith, not in these types of voluntary disclosures, but in the compliance market. And there I think we're seeing really some very important things in terms of improvements. And if those could be implemented more fully, I would actually become a lot more optimistic about how this is proceeding. So I'll get to that, to the mandatory regulation part in a minute. Let me give you just two more of these examples here. Here is an airline that most of you have heard about, United Airlines, one of the largest airlines in the world. They emit by themselves 42 million tons of CO2. That's about, with the number earlier, that's about 1/10 of 1% of total global emissions. So it's significant. It's largely all from the emissions of jet fuel. That's why air travel is becoming increasingly into the focus in many of these discussions. What do they say? Exactly as we discussed. By 2050, we will figure this out. But they're not telling you much more, other than we are investing in one of these so-called carbon capture removal programs, where we are working with a company that somewhere else in the world is actually removing CO2 from the atmosphere. That's very expensive, and we're doing it only on a relatively small scale, but that's what we're doing. And generally, we're hoping for basically a substitute to traditional kerosene, the jet fuel that's being used today, in the form of what's called a sustainable aviation fuel. If we really have a lot of time, I'll get sort of to that part in the very end today, whether that sort of looks realistic, these types of substitutions within a couple of decades. Let me actually skip Excel. Here is one that all of us are familiar with, and I have included that one because Google plays this game, and I call it a game, a public relations game, probably as well as anybody. So if you go to Google's recent disclosures, sustainability disclosures, they will tell you, first of all, we don't have that much in emissions. Yes, what do we do? Well, we run a lot, of course, we consume a lot of electricity through our servers, through our data centers. But we have been carbon neutral since 2007. And moreover, Google is probably the only major firm in the world that will tell you we have already eliminated all the CO2 that we ever put into the atmosphere since our company started. Say Google was started by roughly 1995, somewhere around there, plus or minus a few years. But their claim is by 2020, 2 years ago, we had already undone all the damage to the atmosphere we ever did. So we're really golden, if you want to, in that terms. How does Google do that? Here again, it comes to the question of how do you count things? Google has, and there's no two questions about it, been one of the early developers, financiers of renewable power all over the world. What does Google do? It basically builds a solar facility or it builds a wind park somewhere in the world. Of course, that location is chosen carefully in terms of the economics, but it has nothing to do with the power that Google consumes at its various data centers. But here the numbers now go. Google does basically a swap. This is, we're saying, yep, that kilowatt hour at our data center was in fact generated somewhere else in the world, and we want credit for it. So this has nothing to do with the electrons that are being consumed, the power that is being consumed. It is just a calculation which says we have used that much electricity, we have produced that much clean electricity, and the amount of clean electricity we've produced is larger than what we're consuming. In fact, if you add it all up across the years, we have a positive balance. Bingo, we are, in a legacy sense, completely climate neutral. That's what the types of things that you face here. Now, I would actually argue this is not that far apart or not that different when Deutsche Bahn tells you we only drive with Ökostrom around here, right? You read that every day. They're doing a similar construction. Are they really only getting power, electricity, from renewable sources? I doubt it very much. I don't know the details, but they're getting it from the grid, just like Google does, but they're claiming the full credit for it. So this is the kind of games and issues we, I think, all need to be aware of when companies are making these grand claims. And there is, at the moment, there are a few companies out there, and if you sort of want to take our course later on, we'll talk about those, that are a little more careful in the way how they do the accounting. These guys are not particularly careful in my mind. Yeah.
Now, I mean, even car manufacturers are thinking about including the emissions that are caused by consumers driving the cars, right? And if you think about Google, system boundaries could also include consumers, right? And you could say that consumers using Google services are causing emissions that are maybe not accounted for in the current system boundaries that they draw, right?
Yeah. And so here, you may have seen on my last slide, what does Google do on this one? It takes a very conservative position. It only includes employee travel and commuting. These are the so-called indirect emissions, or under the so-called International Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the Scope 3 emissions. And Google takes a very narrow definition, and that makes it possible then to say, we're golden, okay? We never did anything, so to speak. In fact, what you're raising, Laura, brings me sort of to this whole question. There is, on the question of the carbon footprint, there's at the moment an enormous discussion going on whether you should really include everything, not just what comes out the chimney of your own factories, the so-called direct emissions, the tailpipes emissions from cars, but whether you should also include everything that is associated with the supply chain of this firm. So all your suppliers, what are their emissions? And you see there my second point, a company like Toyota will implement the International Greenhouse Gas Protocol faithfully, or at least so they say they want to do that. But that is, of course, an enormously hard problem. Why? Because now you need to ask yourself, okay, I sold that many Toyotas, that many passenger cars last year, and now I'm going to project what the emissions associated with those cars are going to be over the life cycle of the car. You can see that this requires an enormous amount of estimation, with Toyota cars being sold all over the world. You can come up with an estimate. Anybody can come up with an estimate. But the big question is that really a reliable number? Will that be able to tell us something about progress, also progress that a particular company is making? And unfortunately for a company like Toyota, when at the end of the day these so-called indirect emissions are more than 99% of the total. So it gets sort of totally dominates the picture in the reporting. So now you have really an unfortunate situation where numbers that are being reported are basically dominated by estimates that by their very nature must be very crude and very hard to verify for anybody. The last point here, and then I'll move on, is this whole issue of offsets that we mentioned briefly. This is something that is now becoming the latest sort of game in town here. So remember, I have my emissions, but I can subtract if what was earlier called compensation, or if I have a so-called offset. So the cleanest offsets, the one where everybody would say, yeah, that's probably okay, is say what United Airlines does when it works with a company, say in Switzerland, Climeworks, and contracts with Climeworks to really literally filter the CO2 out of the atmosphere and inject it into the ground somewhere in Iceland where it mineralizes. People would say, that is probably a ton of CO2 removed. Yeah? But this whole offset category now has a whole bunch of other things in them that companies do count as compensation or as offsets. I mentioned Google earlier. So in other words, if I'm building a solar facility somewhere in the world, I want to count that as an offset against my gross emissions. This has gone totally crazy, and here the key statistic on this is basically anything goes. A piece of land, a forest. How does this work? Well, I own this land here. It has currently a forest on it. I'm about to take a saw and cut this off. But if you want to pay me a certain amount of money, I'll let the tree stand. So you see how this construction goes? This is entirely a hypothetical. Are you willing to pay me to preserve a particular carbon sink in this? And then I want to be paid for this. The scary thing is the average price in these so-called voluntary carbon markets for offsets, the average price is currently somewhere around $5 per ton. We all believe the price of carbon must be a lot higher than $5. Since you mentioned earlier the European regulations, we are currently, and you'll see the chart in a moment, we're currently at 80 euros or 90 euros a ton. So at $5 per ton, this doesn't mean much. But, and here is the chart, these voluntary carbon markets where all sorts of companies buy offsets, this is really has already gone through the roof in the last few years, and everybody predicts this is going to go up even further, very dramatically. And basically a whole bunch of different projects are being offered up as eligible offsets. The point is, in today's environment, there's nobody to tell you that this shouldn't count. Everybody plays their own game. Everybody sort of does their own thing in terms of saying, well, I just compensated or I offset a certain number of emissions through this. So I called it the Wild West. What's needed here is a framework. And on this slide here, let me just sort of at the very bottom you see, you shouldn't be too surprised when companies now play this game also with the offsets to selectively advertise individual products as being carbon neutral. The other day I walked into a grocery store, and the first thing I look at are carbon neutral Reibekuchen, and you go, how in the world did you do that? The answer is, well, we bought a few offsets for $5 a ton, and then I can tell people that my Reibekuchen have no carbon footprint. Great. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, let me, yeah. While you get the microphone, should I just keep going at this pace for the whole thing, or should I stop at some point? What do you think is most useful? Just keep going. Okay.
So, I mean, obviously this looks quite bad, and I mean, if it's not regulated, can you hear me? Yeah. If it's not well regulated, then it doesn't work. I mean, $5 per ton of CO2. But aren't there also possible virtues in a well-regulated offset system? I mean, of course, it is efficient to abate emissions where it is most effective. So, I mean, if Google builds a solar park in California, that is obviously less efficient than building it where the electricity is much dirtier. So, I mean, that's essentially why we do cap and trade, to have like the abatement where it is cheapest. So, I mean, wouldn't there be a case for like efficient offsetting on a global scale?
Yes, I would argue that there should be, and I would also go a step further in that, since you just mentioned cap and trade, and that's the direction I'm going into now. I would like actually for the possibility to exist that certain types of offsets can be traded also in the so-called compliance market, say under the European ETS system. If, again, to the example of Climeworks in Switzerland, sequestering, first capturing and then sequestering the CO2 somewhere in Iceland, if this is sort of well certified, I see that really as a apples-to-apples comparison in terms of a ton of CO2 that has been removed as opposed to sent into the atmosphere. So the company like Climeworks should be entitled basically to an €80 credit if that's the current price. And that would, exactly as you say, should also enable then efficient and cost minimizing ways of reducing emissions. Absolutely. Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have that in the regulatory environment either. So here's a picture that when I sort of, when we go to the question, is this overall decarbonization process, is this really still progressing fast enough, or are we pretty much, are we going to miss out on the goals, say that the climate scientists, and in particular the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has told us about? Here's a chart from McKinsey. And let me say immediately, I'm not endorsing this chart, but I think it's a good way to think about the problem and think about the dynamic. So you see, they're starting out in terms of the world being at in 2022 at an emission level roughly around 40 billion tons of CO2. That is, by the way, the 36 billion tons that I showed you on the very first slide, plus another 5 billion comes from through the change of land use. So in particular, say what has been happening in regions like Brazil, the rainforest, parts of Africa, where forests are being depleted, and therefore additional emissions are coming not from fossil fuel sources, but from the change of land use. So what does sort of McKinsey tell us? Well, it could go like this, where the world now pretty soon, pretty much right now, turns the corner, reduces its emission at a relatively steep rate. It does that until roughly 2030. Then we're progressing to zero at a lower rate, at a slower rate. But we're never getting quite to zero. But this is where the net part comes in, the offsets, or the negative emissions in this case, in blue, so that really then by 2050, the black and the blue cancel each other. So there we have a net zero position. And now the point of all of this is that if that trajectory were to happen, this is of course a gigantic if, but if that were to happen, are we then fine? And the point here is McKinsey sort of looked up what the International Greenhouse Gas Panel, the IPCC tells us. It tells us that if we want to have at least a 50% chance of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels, we should stay within a so-called carbon budget of 570 gigatons. And so the point is, if you add all of this up, all the black bars minus the blue bars, the area under the curve, that adds up to 570. So I call this sort of the overflowing bathtub. And the hope is that this bathtub will not overflow. Overflow means it can only take in total 570 gigatons. I mean, there's a whole sort of now, of course, broader discussion on this is a point estimate. A, is this going to happen? And B, how far could we deviate from this without sort of suffering really severe damage? But that's for another talk. Okay. The reason that I think this is useful to think of it in those terms, the world has a carbon budget left. Okay, fine. How do we now get different parts of the world, different countries, different economic blocs, think of China, India, North America, Europe, to collectively go down this path or go down a path that adds up to 570 in total? That's sort of the international coordination problem. That's what I would hope countries would do at the climate summits, say like last November in Glasgow, where they basically reach agreement on these individual carbon reduction or carbon emission curves, and these add up properly to something like this one. This is sort of, think of this as a sort of a budget of what we have left. Now, how can you get these declines, and how can you ensure that really we stay within these budgets? So that's where we're coming back sort of to economic theory and to questions of what economic policies, regulatory policies, would give us a chance to make this work. So the first observation here is you can do this in one of two ways. You can either provide subsidies for clean electricity, and countries like the US have done a lot of that. So for instance, in the form of tax credits or so-called renewable portfolio standards. I won't have time to sort of explain this right now in great detail. But the other alternative that Europe in particular adopted was the ETS that several of you now asked about, goes in the other direction and basically says we're making emissions or high carbon intensive technologies more expensive because you have to get a permit. You have to basically pay a price, you pay a carbon tax when you buy this permit on the market. Yeah? If we of course have such a system, then such a cap and trade system where we're limiting the number of permits, emissions that we're issuing in an economy, or in this case in an economic bloc, that in my mind is a much more stringent and much more believable set of instruments than going down the route of subsidizing the clean energy solutions, because then you never know, are these subsidies large enough? So the economist here sort of feels good if you think of this now, say, as the European Union rather than the global problem. If the European Union sort of commits over the next 30 years, there are going to be that many permits to issue CO2 issued, then we could sort of say, and that is a commitment and that is not up for grabs, then we could say that should make us confident really that at least Europe will do its part to not increase, not go through these emission limits, the budgets that Europe would have out of such an international agreement. So in my mind, quantity regulation, namely how much more in emissions are we going to allow, makes this thing a lot more credible than the other policy tools that the world has sort of been playing with. So that brings me then really to the EU ETS finally. Here is a price chart. For many years, people in the sort of all over the world were making fun of this system and saying this is not really working. Why? Because prices were so low. They were also back to the €5 per ton until a couple of years ago. Prices were very low. There's of course a large discussion of why that was, but the net effect was that people said this isn't working. If the prices of a ton of carbon on these exchanges are so low, that's an indication that A, nobody's going to pay any attention or do anything different, and B, that it's an indication that it's an ineffective regulation. I personally want to sort of convince people to think of it the other way around. This is, if the commitment to the quantities is there, this is a very effective regulation because it would tell us what our total emissions are going to be over the next 20 or 30 years. And furthermore, the goal of policies now, of other policies that government, particularly the German government, can do as it wants to move this along, should be to keep those prices as low as possible. As long as the quantities are not violated, it's a good thing if people don't have to pay too much for that CO2. But you need the quantity commitment in the first place for this to work. Yeah? And you see here, in the current environment, say in a country like Germany, unfortunately, and I think this is very regrettable, we are not really implementing this cap and trade system in a consistent fashion. Many industries like power generation, certain manufacturing industries like steel and cement are covered by it, but all very important sectors that are responsible for a lot of the emissions are still left out. The whole transportation sector until last year only paid 25 euros per ton, as opposed to the 80 that you see up there. And even that was hard to get out of the previous government in terms of its willingness to say, okay, we're also going to include the transportation sector in this. We talk in connection with the whole Russia debate at the moment about heating and the worries about oil and gas being needed to heat homes and buildings. That's also not included, and at the moment still pays, I think at the moment it is 30 euros per ton, but obviously that's far away from the market price for other emissions. And that's where most economists, and I fully agree, would say there is no reason for this type of differentiation. This must be the law of one price that covers all of these emissions, precisely to get to your point, to find the least costly way of reducing those emissions, and for that everybody needs to basically face the same price. Aviation, we mentioned earlier, there my understanding is that it's actually it's a little weird. If the flight is within the European Union, then you do need to buy a permit at 80 euros. But if you're flying outside Europe, then it's a different ballgame. So in short, this has not been implemented yet consistently. I would feel a lot better if there was that iron commitment. So many permits will be issued over the next 20 years, and it's one price. Then things would really get going a lot faster. Yeah.
About the carbon budget that we have, and you said it's okay if we manage to meet this goal in the end, but there are also these tipping points along the way, right, that many people now speak about and say the shape of the curve is also very important, right? It's not about just keeping the budget, but also making progress as fast as possible so we don't reach certain tipping points, right?
Yeah, so there, of course, I'm taking, you're absolutely right, I'm taking slightly simplifying perspective that the IPCC has told us if we stay within the 1.5 degree limit, then we would stay away from the tipping points. Now, if this curve, here the earlier one, if this looks different in that the total adds up to something like 600 or 700, and again, this is a huge chapter in all of this, the temperature is presumably still not reaching 2 degrees Celsius. Everybody agrees that's the point where we're really going into unknown territory. But the question is the likelihood of a tipping point already emerging if we say went to 600 or 700 gigatons in total?
Yeah, let's say we kind of are very slow in developing our climate action and we wait until a very late stage. Can we really trust this estimation that the tipping points will not occur in that time?
I wouldn't know. I'm basically here going essentially this is something that the climate scientists need to tell us how much confidence and how much of a risk we're taking there. I mean, my understanding is if you were to draw this curve, say you have the same total bathtub model, but you draw this curve slightly different so that you delay a little bit early on, but then you're compensating for that by going steeper a little later. My understanding is, at least if we are staying to the left of the 1.5 degree goal, that would not, in the mind of, and again, I'm not sure whether there's a consensus on this, but this is at least what the IPCC has been articulating. We wouldn't be playing with fire on that one.
And maybe just one more question about the rainforests in Brazil, because you mentioned them.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned this example of offsetting when there is a person that has this piece of land and threatens to cut down the trees, but then doesn't do so. There is also this discussion about which incentives should we use to make countries that have natural resources protect them better, right? And how do you see the chances of these economic incentives for countries like Brazil, but also other countries that have relevant resources that should be protected?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to one of the earlier questions. There are in particular, if we now sort of do make this the type of progress we're looking for here, there will be considerable differences in terms of what is the economists, as you know, Laura, have the concept of the cost per ton abated, that is the ton avoided in all of this, or reduced. And that's going to differ a great deal, and in particular developing countries arguably may have a much lower cost. If in the first place they were part of such a global regulation scheme in terms of a quota that they would have their own carbon budgets and they were included in these carbon markets, I would have a lot more confidence that really those who can do it more cheaply will do it first, and that's in everybody's interest. Yeah? I mean, that's the beauty if you had a global market. Thus far, I mean, the best I've heard is that possibly at some point, say if you look at the US, there is California and a couple of states on the East Coast that have a regional greenhouse gas initiative, also sort of a cap and trade system. There is, in Canada now is coming in. Some people are saying this may before long, say, integrate with the European trading system. That would already be a major step forward. And then you could say, perhaps, you know, at some point, other countries, and probably it's going to be the industrialized countries first, following suit. But yeah, the logic of the system says the more countries are under that umbrella, the more efficient the solution. So let me, in the last 12 minutes, if I see this right, talk a little bit about why I think it's actually not looking as bad as you may think or as I have suggested so far. And now we're getting into this whole question about alternatives to traditional fossil fuels. And what I've listed here is basically the so-called clean energy technologies that we read a lot about, in particular here in Germany, but also in other parts of the world. Renewable electricity, we mentioned earlier, still small, but growing very rapidly. Energy storage, everybody sort of agrees because the renewables, in particular wind and solar, are not that dependable. We all know their limitations. Energy storage will have to be a much larger part of the equation. And so storage can come in different forms, in batteries, as we're seeing now, in the form of batteries going into electric vehicles, but also chemical storage here. So I mentioned in particular hydrogen. So this, you may have followed this. The new hydrogen economy is being trumped up in all sorts of quarters these days as something that we're going to see a lot more of, and that's a way to basically take all that renewable electricity and convert it, store it, and then use it again when we need. The last sector where that is probably less in the public discussion that we're working on a lot here at our Mannheim Institute for Sustainable Energy Studies is a decarbonization of industrial processes. In the last federal election, I think the steel industry was being mentioned a lot, and people talked about, can we use hydrogen instead of coal to produce steel? Those are the kinds of things that people are now beginning to pay attention to, in part because the use of coal in the production of steel has a price tag of 80 euros per ton. And so the steel makers are going, well, perhaps I should use an alternative, a substitute material in my processes. There is a lot to be had there on that part. The point that I want to convey is progress on these new technologies has been enormous. Everybody, of course, knows that solar and wind have gotten cheaper. We read about this. But how quick? That's sort of the last point here that I want to convey. Economists do this with so-called learning curves. And it may take a moment to sort of get the concept, but I still have a few minutes, so I'll try to sort of drive it in quickly. So this focuses on solar photovoltaic power as perhaps the oldest of the new technologies, having started in roughly the 1970s with exotic applications in space travel and whatnot, but now, of course, being deployed all over the world. So first thing you have on the horizontal axis is the total number of deployments of solar systems through the world. So this is measured in watts, and in particular then, since these are going to be large quantities, in so-called gigawatts, so billions of watts. Yeah? We of course know if you have a solar system on your rooftop or your parents' rooftops, that's something like, say, 6 kilowatt. So then we're going to 1,000 times more. We're going to a megawatt, 1,000,000 watts, and then we're going to a gigawatt. And so that's billions of watts. That's a large quantity. The other thing to notice is this is a weird scale. It's on a logarithmic scale. So you see I have equal distances between 50, 100, 200, 500, and 1,000 here. So it's on a logarithmic basis. And the same over on the other axis, that is in dollars and in cents, but actually, once again, on a logarithmic scale here. Yeah? So what do you see? These are the so-called, for large solar systems. So these is, think of this somewhere out on a field, a large installation, larger than 1 megawatt. What has the so-called life cycle cost of electricity, which is basically tells us what you would, the investor would need to sell this for in order to be making money on this when he builds a system that lasts for say 30 years. And the point is, again, on this logarithmic scale, you see the numbers there. I hope you see the numbers. If we take as the upper one, the dashed one, this is Germany. The other one is California. California, of course, has lower costs because it has more sun. So if you focus on the German one, in 2010, the cost would have been 48 cents per kilowatt hour for such a system. That's actually roughly in line with what Germany paid early on in its feed-in tariffs to people who put a solar system on their rooftop. So it was, in fact, a little higher. So in 2010, a larger system, you could produce roughly 1 kilowatt hour for 48 cents. That has come down to, nowadays, this is without any subsidies, and we can talk a little bit about some of the parameter assumptions, coming down to 5 cents over this 10-year, 9-year period. Yeah? And in California, you see a parallel curve, not quite as steep, but California also started out with better numbers to begin with. But again, orders of magnitude, anywhere from 26 cents per kilowatt hour to now 4 cents. In fact, in California, we've recently seen deals being made where the power of by the solar producers was sold for 2 cents per kilowatt hour on average. So that is really something to keep in mind. Now, I remember already 5 years ago, people will say, well, yeah, okay, they have been on this very steep cost decline, but that must end sooner or later. You know, this can't go on like this. Well, so far, we have not seen the end of it, and I'm going to make the point now in a moment here with onshore wind. You see a similar curve. In fact, it is even a faster curve. When I should have said this a moment ago, when I have here what's called a so-called 60% learning curve for utility scale solar, say in California, the interpretation of this is every time you double the number of installations, your cost is only 60% of what it was before you doubled the number of installations. So with every doubling of the cumulative experience, that's why it's called learning, your cost drops by another 40%. If that persists, we're going to get very soon to a situation where we're going to get under 1 cent per kilowatt hour, precisely because so much solar is being deployed all over the world. And then it is no question also that in terms of the comparison and the race, any fossil fuel here is left way behind. Now we're getting numbers of 5 or 6 cents very easily if you do the comparison. Yes?
Just to have like an idea about the scale, how do other forms of energy provider or how much does a like kilowatt hour usually cost? For me, it's just hard to say.
Yes.
Okay, how much?
Right.
Of course, 1 cent is much less than 48. But how much?
If we start first of all, what we are all paying for electricity, we know that is closer to what is it nowadays, 35 euro cents per kilowatt hour. So, but that's what you pay retail as a consumer. But in terms of the cost of generating the electricity, say from a coal-fired power plant or a natural gas-fired power plant, which are sort of the competitors, they are, I would say, in the current environment, somewhere around 6 to 7 cents. So solar in Germany is already the cheapest source. Now, problem still is the sun only shines, as we know, on certain days and only for certain hours. So that doesn't mean that this race is over, so to speak. But what we are seeing in California, which I've sort of followed more closely, in California, basically all the new deployments, all the new power generation deployments are renewables. In other words, certainly nobody's building a coal-fired power plant anymore, and there's very little natural gas additions to the plant. That's obviously the first step of really turning all of this around. And the point here is these are still relatively young technologies, but the cost has dropped like a rock for solar, for wind, and if I had more time, was going to talk a little bit about hydrogen. Here we're seeing similar curves, not quite as fast, but on the other hand, hydrogen is still in its very infancy, and we haven't had that much of deployments yet in terms of production facilities. So these things make me sort of at the end of the day sort of optimistic that it's turning in certain countries the fastest, but then to your earlier questions, once the cost race has been won, the conflict sort of goes away, and the followers will have a natural incentive to install the clean energy solutions. I'm going to call it a day now because I see that I'm down to a minute. The last part of what I had hoped to talk, and we can do this perhaps on some other occasion, is sort of back to the whole question of CO2 as a bad, an economic bad. We're all worried about the concentrations of CO2. But another way to think about this, and I think this will be coming sort of a reality in, say, 5 to 10 years, is CO2 is actually a valuable resource. Yes, we have too much of it in the atmosphere, but it is already nowadays, it's being traded as a commodity. A ton of CO2, say a food producer or a fertilizer producer, pays a lot of money to get CO2. On the sour note in all of this is, where do they get the CO2 from? The one who manufactures it, the answer is from natural gas at the moment. Not so great, but that can change. If we get that CO2 from other sources, there will be sort of a new type of, if you want to, molecule economy in which CO2, hydrogen, start to give us all sorts of synthetic materials that are replacing the traditional carbon fuels. And that will be the way ultimately to really get in the tail end of this McKinsey curve that I talked to get to the kind of reductions that are needed. So in short, I don't think all is lost. It does require continued regulation to accelerate this transition. But even though so far progress has been slow, there are some very promising signs on the horizon that this can still work in time. That's all I had to say. Hmm?
Das war echt sehr, sehr gut, finde ich. Also spannend und man hätte jetzt noch länger weitermachen können, ne?
Ja, ist immer so die Frage, ob man in ein paar dieser Sachen nicht, also wenn ich versuche darzustellen, hier, es gibt durchaus Hoffnung, das sozusagen zu belegen. Das,
Aber guck mal, was ich dann immer denke, was da jetzt schon für ein Riesengap ist an Verständnis des Themas zwischen dir, der super tief drin ist, mir, die sich sogar irgendwie auch schon ein bisschen
Ja?
den Studis, die ja auch schon zur informierten Elite gehören. Und dann überleg mal, was in der Gesellschaft noch alles da ist, die so wenig, ne, von dieser, das ist ja auch komplex.
Natürlich ist es komplex.
Wie kriegt man das hin, weißt du? Also